I didn't ruin my life with a dramatic decision. I ruined it with a small mistake that took less than 10 seconds. People love stories where guilt arrives like thunder. In my case, it arrived like a slow leak. At first you don't notice it. You keep living. You keep smiling. You keep answering questions. And then one day you realize you've been drowning for years. I have never told this story out loud. Not fully. Not honestly. I have hinted at it with vague phrases. I have buried it under the kind of silence that looks like maturity. But silence isn't maturity. Silence is just fear that learned how to behave. The night it happened, I was working a shift I didn't even want. I had switched with someone because I was trying to be helpful, trying to be reliable, trying to be the kind of person people could count on. That was my pattern back then. I said yes, even when my body was begging for no. It was late. The kind of late where the hospital feels like a different planet. The hallways look longer, the lights feel harsher, and every sound echoes like it wants to accuse you of something. I remember thinking, just get through the night. That was all I wanted. Not excellence. Not heroism. Just survival. And there's something ugly that happens when survival becomes your primary goal. You stop being careful. You start cutting corners, not because you don't care, but because you can't carry the weight of caring for 12 hours straight. I was tired. Not the polite kind of tired. The kind that makes your thoughts thick, your hands slightly clumsy, your attention narrow. The kind that turns simple tasks into risks without warning you. The patient was older, fragile, the kind who looked like they had already spent too much time waiting for bad news. He wasn't alone. Someone sat with him, speaking quietly, holding his hand as if they could physically keep him in the world by refusing to let go. I didn't know his whole story. I didn't need to. In my job, you learn to protect yourself by not knowing too much. Names become charts. Faces become tasks. You tell yourself it's professional, but sometimes it's just self-defense. I checked the orders. I prepared what I believed I needed. I walked down the corridor carrying a small tray, my mind already counting the next tasks like steps on a staircase. And then, in a moment so small I still hate how ordinary it was, I made the mistake. Wrong dosage. Wrong syringe. Wrong decision. It wasn't careless in the way people imagine. It was worse. It was normal. It was the kind of error that happens when systems rely on exhausted human beings and call it sustainable. I realized it almost immediately. Not immediately enough to stop it, but quickly enough to feel my stomach turn into a cold fist. There's a moment after you've done something irreversible where reality changes texture. The air feels heavier. The room feels too bright. Sounds become sharp. You can hear your own blood like it's trying to escape your body. I remember staring at the label, reading it again and again, like repetition could change the letters. Like I could will the truth into a different shape. I remember my hands. They didn't shake the way I expected. They went numb. That was the first warning sign that my mind was already planning how to survive this. I didn't call for help immediately. I did something worse. I hesitated. Hesitation is where morality goes to die. It is the space between who you believe you are and what you are willing to do when fear enters the room. I told myself, maybe it'll be fine. Maybe the harm won't be as bad as I think. Maybe I'm overreacting. I negotiated with reality because I couldn't bear the alternative, that I had harmed someone who trusted me with their life. When the symptoms started, they were subtle. He looked uncomfortable. His breathing changed. The person beside him stood up, alarm rising in their voice. A nurse from another room peeked in. Someone pressed the call button. The room filled with motion. That's the part people don't understand. In the movies, the guilty person stands frozen while chaos swirls around them. In real life, you move. You act. You become helpful. You become competent. You become the person everyone expects you to be, because if you stop moving you might collapse right there on the floor and confess with your whole body. I helped. I adjusted. I monitored. I pretended to be focused on the crisis, as if I were simply part of the team responding to an unexpected complication. But inside, I was screaming. This is because of you. This is because of you. This is because of you. They stabilized him for a while. That bought me hope, which is the cruelest thing you can give a guilty person. Hope doesn't absolve you. It just makes you wait longer for the truth. He didn't die right away. That would have been almost cleaner. He lingered in the gray zone where you're not sure if someone is coming back or simply taking their time leaving. The person beside him didn't leave. They whispered to him, spoke his name, asked him to stay. I watched that devotion like a thief watching someone guard something priceless. At some point, a doctor spoke words I still remember because they felt like a verdict: complications, underlying conditions, unpredictable response. Unpredictable. That word gave everyone else a place to rest their minds. It gave them a reason not to look too closely. It gave them a story that made sense. And it gave me an opening. I could have confessed then. Right there. I could have said, I made a mistake and you need to know. I could have owned it like an adult. I could have accepted whatever consequences followed. But I didn't. Because another truth rose up in me, cold and shameful: if I confessed, I would lose everything. My job. My license. My reputation. My future. I would become a cautionary tale, a headline, a whispered story in break rooms. And I was terrified that I deserved it. That's the sick logic of guilt. It convinces you that consequences are not just punishment, but identity. That if you are punished, you will finally become the monster you fear you already are. So I did what scared people do. I tried to control the story. I documented carefully. I used language that could be interpreted in multiple ways. I followed procedures just enough to look flawless. I acted helpful, cooperative, professional. I became the calm person in the room because the calm person in the room is rarely suspected. When the man finally died, it happened quietly. Not in my arms. Not with me as the central figure. It happened at a time when I was down the hall, charting. That's how life works. It doesn't give you the cinematic moment you think you deserve. It just lets the truth occur while you're busy pretending it isn't. I heard the news from someone else. A brief sentence, spoken in the tone people use when tragedy has become routine. I stood there and nodded like I was processing information, like any professional would. Inside, something in me went completely still. I expected immediate collapse. I expected tears. I expected regret so heavy I'd confess on the spot. But what I felt first was something else. Relief. And that relief is the part I have never forgiven myself for. Relief that it was over. Relief that the crisis had a conclusion. Relief that I didn't have to keep watching him hover between life and death while my secret sat in my throat like poison. Relief that no one had pointed at me. That was the moment I understood what I had done beyond the mistake. The mistake was a tragedy. But what followed was a choice. A choice to protect myself with silence. A choice to let the world believe a story that kept me safe. That choice became the foundation of everything that came after. Because once you survive something like that without confession, you don't go back to being the person you were before. You become someone who knows what they are capable of hiding. And that knowledge changes you in ways no punishment ever could. In the weeks that followed, I lived like a ghost inside my own skin. I smiled at the right times. I did my work. I went home. I ate. I slept. I answered messages. But nothing tasted real. Every normal moment felt stolen. Like I was wearing someone else's life, someone who deserved it more than I did. I began to avoid mirrors because my own eyes looked like they knew too much. Then came the second part of the story, the part that turned my guilt into a life sentence. They started investigating. Not aggressively. Not like in television dramas. Hospitals don't move like that. They move slowly, bureaucratically, politely. A review. A meeting. A quiet request for clarification. A few questions that felt casual, but weren't. I sat in those conversations and felt my entire future balancing on the tip of my tongue. One honest sentence could have ended everything. One lie could keep me safe. And I realized something terrifying. I had already practiced lying. Not with words. With behavior. With calm. With the way I carried my face like it had nothing to hide. I told myself I would confess if it got serious. I told myself I would confess if someone innocent got blamed. I told myself I still had morals, still had a line I wouldn't cross. But guilt doesn't keep you honest. It makes you adaptive. And I was adapting fast. The investigation never exploded into my life. It seeped into it. That was the most unsettling part. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic confrontations. Just emails marked routine review. Meetings scheduled weeks in advance. People thanking me for my cooperation. Politeness can be terrifying when you're hiding something. Every time my phone buzzed, my body reacted before my mind did. A sharp tightening in my chest. A brief wave of nausea. I learned what real anxiety feels like, not panic, not hysteria, but constant vigilance. The kind that never sleeps. I replayed the night endlessly in my head, searching for alternative timelines. If I had noticed sooner. If I had stopped myself. If I had spoken up immediately. My mind treated the past like a puzzle that could still be solved, as if enough analysis could change the outcome. It couldn't. What I could change was the present. And slowly, without ever naming it as such, I began constructing a version of events that could survive scrutiny. Not an obvious lie. A selective truth. I emphasized workload. Fatigue. Systemic issues. I framed my actions as reasonable responses under pressure. I spoke the language of protocols and probabilities. I never denied anything outright, I just never connected the dots. I watched people nod as I spoke. That nodding did something dangerous to me. It validated the performance. Every time someone accepted my explanation, the weight on my chest eased just enough for me to keep going. And every time it eased, the idea of confessing became more abstract, more distant, like a moral luxury I could no longer afford. Then something happened that forced the question back into focus. They called me into another meeting. Smaller this time. Fewer people. More serious tone. Someone asked a question that went directly to the heart of the mistake, phrased gently, but precisely. For a moment, I thought this was it. The moment where silence would collapse under its own weight. I felt the words rise up. The truth. Clear. Simple. Devastating. I made an error. I could have said it. I should have said it. Instead, I hesitated, and in that hesitation, fear made the decision for me. I deflected. I explained. I used the same careful phrasing I had practiced alone at night. I watched their expressions remain neutral, professional. No one interrupted me. When the meeting ended, one of them said, "Thank you for being so thorough." That sentence followed me for weeks. Thorough. I had been thorough in hiding. Thorough in protecting myself. Thorough in making sure the truth stayed fragmented enough that no one could assemble it fully. That was the moment I crossed a line I can never uncross. Before that, I was someone who had made a terrible mistake and hadn't yet found the courage to face it. After that, I became someone actively maintaining a lie. There is a difference. The guilt changed shape after that. It stopped being sharp and became heavy. Dense. Something I carried everywhere. It showed up in unexpected ways, in irritability, in withdrawal, in an inability to tolerate small talk. I stopped feeling present in my own life. Every achievement felt fraudulent. Every compliment felt like an accusation. I began to fear moments of praise more than criticism, because praise implied trust and trust felt undeserved. At night, I imagined different outcomes. Not fantasies where I was forgiven. Fantasies where I was caught. In those imagined scenarios, I felt something disturbingly close to relief. As if exposure would finally give my guilt a shape, an ending. Living without resolution was exhausting. Carrying a secret with no expiration date slowly hollowed me out. I started pulling away from people. Not dramatically. Subtly. I cancelled plans. I avoided conversations that drifted toward meaning or morality. I couldn't bear the idea of being seen clearly while hiding something so fundamental. I also began to understand something else, something darker. The longer I stayed silent, the less I felt like I had the right to speak. Confession felt pure in theory. In practice, it felt selfish. It would destroy lives, careers, reputations, including my own years after the fact. It would reopen wounds for people who had already learned to live with loss. I told myself I was protecting them. That justification became my refuge. But protection without consent is just control wearing a kinder mask. Months passed. The investigation concluded. Official language was used. Lessons were learned. Procedures were updated. Responsibility dissolved into system-wide reflection. No one said my name. When I received the email stating that the review was closed, I stared at the screen for a long time. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the strange emptiness that followed survival. I had gotten away with it. That sentence should have brought relief. Instead, it landed like a curse. Because now, there would be no forced ending. No confrontation. No absolution through punishment. The truth would live only inside me, unchallenged and unshared. And that meant it would follow me everywhere. I tried to return to normal life. I really did. I told myself I had learned my lesson, that I would be more careful, more vigilant, more ethical going forward. I told myself I could make up for it by being better. But you can't compensate for a buried truth by behaving well. The weight didn't lessen. It intensified. I began to feel disconnected from time. Days passed, but they didn't accumulate into a future I could imagine. Everything felt temporary, provisional, like I was living on borrowed ground. That's when the idea first entered my mind. Not confession. Disappearance. The thought frightened me and then comforted me. What if I didn't run from guilt, but from the life that had been built on silence? What if the only way to stop lying was to remove myself from the story entirely? I didn't want forgiveness. I didn't want understanding. I wanted distance. Distance from the person I had become. The idea stayed with me, growing quieter but heavier. Not as an impulse, but as a possibility. A door I could choose not to open or step through when the weight became unbearable. And slowly, I began to realize something terrifying. The mistake hadn't ended that night in the hospital. It had simply begun a life I no longer recognized as my own. I didn't disappear because I wanted a new life. I disappeared because I couldn't live inside the old one anymore. People imagine disappearance as an act of desperation, a sudden break fueled by panic. For me, it was slow. Deliberate. Almost methodical. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to vanish. I arrived at it the same way I arrived at everything else, carefully, after exhausting every other way to keep going. The guilt had stopped screaming by then. That was the most dangerous stage. It had settled into something quieter, more efficient. A constant internal presence that shaped my behavior without demanding attention. I could function. I could smile. I could even laugh. But none of it reached me. I had become a container for a secret that had no outlet. Confession still appeared in my thoughts from time to time, but it no longer felt like redemption. It felt like destruction without repair. It would not bring the man back. It would not undo the silence I had chosen. It would only transfer my burden onto others and call it justice. I don't say that to excuse myself. I say it because that's how my mind worked by then, not innocent, not cruel, just deeply compromised. I started to feel like a ghost moving through a life that technically belonged to me, but emotionally didn't. Every familiar place reminded me of who I was pretending to be. Every routine reinforced the lie. So I began letting go. Not dramatically. Quietly. I reduced my life to essentials. I sold what I didn't need. I stopped making plans that extended too far into the future. I told people I was reconsidering things, which was true in a way that made the phrase almost laughable. No one noticed at first. That's the thing about withdrawal. When you've spent years being reliable, people assume you're just busy. The night before I left, I didn't sleep. Not because I was afraid of being caught, but because I was afraid of feeling nothing. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to imagine the moment of leaving, the door closing, the silence after. I expected panic. I expected grief. What I felt instead was a dull, steady calm. That scared me more than any fear ever had. In the morning, I walked away without ceremony. No notes. No explanations. Not out of cruelty, but because I knew any explanation would still be incomplete. Words would soften things that shouldn't be softened. I didn't want sympathy. I didn't want forgiveness. I wanted responsibility without spectacle. I chose a place where no one knew me. Where my past had no context. Where my name meant nothing. I took work that required attention and humility. Nothing heroic. Nothing redemptive. Just real. Living anonymously stripped me of every shield I had built. There was no reputation to hide behind. No version of myself to maintain. Only the person I was when no one expected anything from me. The guilt didn't disappear. That's important to say. It followed me quieter, but intact. Guilt doesn't leave when you change locations. It leaves only when it is transformed into something honest. Over time, I stopped trying to justify myself. I stopped rehearsing explanations that no one had asked for. I stopped imagining alternative endings where I was forgiven or punished in neat, moral arcs. I accepted that some acts don't end cleanly. They simply become part of you. I think about the man often. About the hand that held his. About the life that ended while I chose silence. That memory does not fade. Nor should it. What has changed is how I carry it. I no longer pretend I am innocent. But I no longer pretend I am irredeemable either. Redemption is not something you claim. It's something you attempt, daily, without witnesses. I live carefully now. Not fearfully attentively. I double check. I pause. I ask for help. I speak up when something feels wrong. Not because it erases the past, but because it honors it. I don't tell this story to ask for understanding. I tell it because silence was my first failure and my second. If there is a lesson here, it isn't about mistakes. Everyone makes them. It isn't even about guilt. Guilt is inevitable when harm occurs. It's about the moment after. The moment when fear offers you a choice, truth with consequences, or safety with the cost you will pay every day after. I chose safety. And I have spent my life paying for it. Not through punishment. Through awareness. Through the knowledge that one small mistake became a defining silence and that silence reshaped everything that followed. I didn't disappear to escape responsibility. I disappeared because staying would have meant continuing to lie not just to others, but to myself. This is not a story of forgiveness. It is a story of consequence. And of learning, far too late, that some lives are not ruined by the mistake itself but by what we choose to do after.